I want to thank Marla and the Hadley Historical Society for collaborating on this project. And Alan is representing the Hadley Historical Society. He is on program committee, and he will introduce our presenter, Marla Miller. Thank you again for joining us.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you, Violet and the Senior Center so much for setting this up and making this possible. I'm Alan Weinberg. I'm with the Hadley Historical Society, and very pleased that we have Marla Miller, who's also a member of the Hadley Historical Society. And for those of you who don't know Marla, I'm sure most of you do, she's the director of the Public History program at UMass. And she's going to talk today to us about women in work in Hadley Taverns. I think it's 1770 to 1820. Do I have the dates right, Marla?
Yes. Yep, you sure do.
And this is, Marla has written at least 2 books that I know of, which are about Hadley history. One is The Entangled Lives, Labor, Livelihood, and Landscapes of Change in Rural Massachusetts, which is her recent book. And I think her talk today will be from that book. And also a previous book, which is Cultivating a Past, Essays on Hadley History, which she edited. So we're very pleased and thrilled that Marla is going to give us a talk. She's a Hadley native, not a Hadley native, a Hadley resident. And again, we're very, very happy to have her. So Marla, it's all yours.
I'll share screen and video.
Thank you. Marla, can I just ask, I notice noises. Can I ask everybody to mute yourself unless you will have questions later for Marla? That will help her to continue without interruptions. Thank you.
Thank you to Violet and to Alan for making this possible. And gosh, there are so many thanks. Many of you know this book came out at the end of 2019. And, you know, we all thought in the spring I would get to talk about it with folks in Hadley, and then the pandemic has come. And so I think this is only like the second time that I've been able to have a conversation with people about the book. So I'm very excited to be with you all virtually today. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank some key people. There are a lot of people to thank. The book Entangled Lives is dedicated to the working women who make all of our lives possible. And there were a lot of women whose work made this project possible. And so key among them that I want to call out today are folks from the Hadley Historical Society, Ellie Needballa and Diane Bai, who really provided access to those collections over the 20 years that I've been at work at this project. And I also want to especially thank Rick and Mary Thayer. This chapter that I'm going to talk about this afternoon would not have been possible. I wouldn't have even thought to do it had they not shared with me an account book in their family history. And you're going to learn about that as we go along. So I really want to thank Rick and Mary, especially for being so generous and letting me get this glimpse into their own family's history. As I was telling them not long ago, I feel like the book is just a big love letter to the working women of Hadley in the past. I might not be a native of the 20th century, but sometimes I feel like I'm a native of 18th century Hadley. So I'm happy to kind of show you all around. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about how I came to the project. And that story doesn't go back to the 18th century, but it goes back a little ways. Let me advance my slide. There we go. So back in 1987, I was a summer fellow at Historic Deerfield. I came out from the Midwest and spent the summer reading and studying in Deerfield. And I was a college undergraduate at the time, and we were all asked to develop research papers. And so I chose as my topic the unusual and distinct lives of ministers' wives in the 18th century. And in the course of that work, I consulted a diary of a woman named Rebecca Dickinson. She lived in Hatfield and was a friend of the minister's wife there. And so I was reading Dickinson's diary mostly to learn about women's lives in Hatfield. And at the end of the summer, the director of academic programs, who was a professor named Kevin Sweeney, asked me if I might want to study the Rebecca Dickinson diary because it was still in family hands, and he thought it really could bear some scrutiny. It would be an interesting project. And so I took that on, and that really opened a lot of doors and took me down the path that I'm still on today. Dickinson was a gown maker in early America, and so I got interested in gown making as a trade for women. And that's really what led me to Hadley. Kevin also explained to me that there was an extensive diary from Elizabeth Porter Phelps in Hadley, and maybe Dickinson, since she lived right over the river, would appear in the Phelps diary. And sure enough, she did, along with like 60 other working women of a variety of kinds, women in the clothing trades, midwives, domestic servants, all kinds of women. And their work is recorded in the diary of Elizabeth Porter Phelps. So that became my dissertation in graduate school and led to my first book, Needle's Eye, which is all about women in the clothing trades. But as I was going along on that project, I started to uncover evidence of other ways that women made a living in early Hadley. And so I kept kind of accumulating these little files. I always call them baskets to my students, a little basket about this and a basket about that. And in time, that became the book that I'm going to talk about today. I thought it would be especially fun for today's conversation to share with you some insights about women's work in what I call the hospitality trade. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next little bit. Oh, and here's the cover of Needle's Eye. So here is a slide of a drawing of a tavern. I believe this is in Pennsylvania. And the sketch artist who created this image drew the tavern keeper and his wife. And here she is serving the clients, and there he is with his feet up on the stove. And for some reason, I find that kind of a fun image to start with today. So in the collections of the Hadley Historical Society, there are papers given by the DAR members early in the 20th century. And one of them is about the tavern at the north end of the Common, known as the Cook Tavern at that time. And it records the story of a woman named Tryphena Newton Cook, who was working in her mother's tavern. And in the story, there's a guy at the tavern and he's giving her a hard time and she's trying to keep him, at bay. And finally, kind of tired of his coarse overtures, she clocks him, knocks him down. And in the story, he gets up kind of sputtering and he says that he would only submit to that because she was a woman. And she allegedly retorted that she had only submitted to as much as she had because she was a woman. And so you get this little glimpse into the work of tavern keeping, both the woman serving the male clientele and also trying to, keep a lid on some rowdy behavior in the tavern. In the course of the research, I came to learn that Tryphena's mother was a widow named Elizabeth Newton, who secured innkeeping licenses almost nonstop from 1781 until 1810. She's the only Hadley woman to appear with regularity in the court records granting tavern licenses, but people at the time knew what later generations forgot. When a guy named Epaphras Hoyt in 1790 left Deerfield for Philadelphia, he recorded in his journal having put up at Mrs. Newton's Tavern at the north end of Hadley. But one thing I'd like to suggest, and I'll talk about as we go along, is that no matter whose name is on the license, women are the keepers of Hadley Taverns. And so that statement is kind of part of the thesis, if you will, that I'd like to share with you today. And that's that women were the leaders of taverns and stood at the center of tavern life, and thus at the center of their communities. That the work, which involved women and their daughters, domestic servants, and enslaved labor, ran along three main lines. That's provisioning, and then all the work of cooking, cleaning, and serving that we kind of imagine. And lastly, the work of preserving good order, like Tryphena was doing in that opening story. And then at the end, I want to say just a word or two about women's work as boarding house. So, in her study of women tavern keepers in the 18th century Connecticut Valley, Anne Lanning, who's the vice president up at Historic Deerfield, found 21 women licensed to act as what's called an innholder, retailer, and common victualler across 14 valley towns. Many of these women were the widows of tavern keepers, but it would be a mistake to assume that these women were stepping into a role that was somehow new to them. In fact, there's plenty of evidence that women were at the center of tavern keeping all along. And this reminds me of an image that I often show my students. One of the projects I worked on before this one was a biography of Betsy Ross. And there's a great newspaper ad for the upholstery shop of Betsy Ross. She was married at that time and her name was Elizabeth Claypool. And it's all, you know, about this upholstery shop of John Claypool, her husband. Well, John Claypool was never an upholsterer. He worked at the customs house. He had other skills, but that was his wife's shop. But because law and custom at the time put men at the head of the household, that ad looks for all the world like the upholstery shop of a man, but it's really the upholstery shop of Betsy Ross. And in the same way, we have to be careful when we see records that make it look like there's a man at the head of the enterprise, because often it could be a woman. And in the case of taverns, it's very much a couple working together. Here's an image of a tavern that still stands in Hatfield. This is Lucy Hubbard's Tavern. And when she obtained her license to be an inn holder, it was in the house, quote, lately improved for that purpose by her late husband, Elisha. After they had decided to open a public house, Elisha renovated this center chimney Georgian house to make it more comfortable in that role. But just a few years later, in 1768, Elisha died at the age of 47, and he left his 41-year-old widow and their 7 children to continue on alone. Lucy Hubbard would go on to run that highly successful tavern in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s in this substantial building that still stands on Elm Street. But again, she was not stepping into a role that was created or defined by her spouse. In fact, it's likely that he stepped into a role created by his spouse. Lucy Stearns Hubbard had grown up in the well-known Worcester Tavern that had been managed for 5 decades by her parents, who were Thomas and Mary Jennison Stearns. It was called the King's Arms, and it was licensed to Thomas for 40 years and to Mary the dozen years after his death. So Lucy was surely undaunted when she found herself running the tavern alone after her own husband's death, as she watched her mother do before her. There's also a series of licenses up in Greenfield that show how taverns kind of ran in extended families. So this is a house that I wrote a National Register nomination for in Greenfield. And in the course of the work, as I was following the male line of inn holders, I discovered that all of these men who hold licenses had all married sisters in the Severance family, who were themselves, you know, they had grown up in a tavern, their parents' tavern. And so even though it appears that this series of taverns now in Franklin County were all run by men, in fact, a lot of the expertise for running those taverns came from these Severance sisters, who were a family, you know, deeply involved in that work and who networked these taverns together. In Hadley, as I mentioned, Elizabeth Newton assumed a license that had been first granted to her husband, Francis, and she would run that business for about 30 years. And in time, the work would be taken over by her daughter and her son-in-law's family, the Cooks. So you see here, this is a page from the court records, and scribbled in right at the bottom of all the other Hadley licenses, it says Elizabeth Newton, and that's the record of her being granted her license as an inn holder. When they first started innkeeping, she and her husband lived in a different kind of house. But around the turn of the 19th century, they built this structure. And I'm going to talk about these kind of buildings in a little bit, but it's a purpose-built tavern. They built this specifically to house that business. The southeast room housed the bar, and there was a door on the south facade that provided direct entry into the tap room. And then upstairs, there was a ballroom or a meeting space that could be, there was a long bench installed permanently against one wall, and there were means to divide the room for separate spaces or one large space, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later too. So because taverns were scenes of a lot of different kinds of events, from entertainments to political assemblies to legal proceedings, the women who ran and worked in them found themselves at the center of public life in ways that I think made women tavern keepers a little different, set them apart from other women around town. So you see here that taxes could be kept or collected at the tavern. You know, people would come around to the tavern to pay their taxes. Here we see another case where there's some estate to be settled and people are invited to come to the house of Mrs. Elizabeth Newton, inholder of Hadley, to settle this estate, to make their claims. Here we have a image of the sociability of the rural tavern. In the Sylvester Judd manuscript, he records the recollections of a woman in Hadley who says that she could remember, it's Mariah Porter Woodward, remembering her father Eleazar walking every day to Elisha and Martha Cook's tavern along the Hadley Town Common, quote, to see the people and hear the news. So news gathering was an important function of the tavern. Also, the newspaper often came to the tavern. Entertainments were often held at the tavern. Newspapers are full of, in this case, there was a Slackwire performance that visitors came to Hadley's Warner Tavern to see, dancing schools, all kinds of festive occasions, exhibitions, this kind of thing brought people together at taverns. And then also they served as nodes, not just in the mail, but in outwork, another way that women earned a living in early America. So towards the early 19th century, when the very beginnings of outwork were unfolding, stagecoaches would come and they would have the materials for men's shirts. And women could come to the stage and say, like, I'll take materials for 30 shirts. And they'd go home. And when they were done with the 30 shirts, they'd bring them back to the stage and exchange them for more materials. And that's how these manufactories were able to produce, you know, shirts by the hundred, because they were farming them out to women in the countryside. But the tavern was a node in those systems of outwork too. So women, of course, were at the heart of all of that. And the account book of Mindwell and Ebenezer Pomeroy, which is kept from the 1750s through the 1790s, is a great glimpse into their enterprise. And I will say, I feel like I've only scratched the surface of this document. There are about 230 men who have accounts in the pages of the account book. So that's obviously many more than were populating their neighborhood. Of those men, about 27% are noted as having come from elsewhere. Sometimes a man is noted as being from Hadley, but most of the entries don't have any identifier, suggesting that they are more or less local. Other men are described as being from nearby Northampton, South Hadley, that's about half of the others, Belchertown, Amherst, Granby, Northfield, Pelham, Springfield, and Sunderland. But there are other customers too, who are listed as coming from Windsor, Connecticut, Tolland, Hartford, and Lebanon in Connecticut, and from points north as well, towns in New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont. So a line I have in the book that I like to say about Mindwell is that from her spot behind the bar, her view extended 75 miles in any direction. So she was born, I should say, in 1721 and lived until 1797. And in that same point about the constellation of family, she's the sister of another tavern keeper in the neighborhood, Zadok Lyman. So here's a shot of the White Horse Tavern and a view from the account book on the right-hand side, and then an engraving from the early 19th century, which I quite like because it shows a woman behind the bar. If we look at the account book and try to parse some of that, we learn the ways the business both shaped and reflected Mindwell's position in the community. And one of the things that I could see in this account book, again, is that if you look at all the work that's documented in this account book, we can see that Ebenezer Pomeroy is out in the fields, he's out doing work, he's in the woodlot, he's everywhere. He cannot be in two places at once. And so we kind of deduce that the work going around the house, the work happening in the tavern, was very much done by Mindwell and her daughters. They're the ones who are kind of managing the public house. The kitchen of the farm served breakfast, dinner, and supper, as well as what they called victuals to both passersby and overnight visitors. Most often, the tavern served dinner, which is the midday meal, and victuals. Dinner might include meat or fish with vegetables. Victuals might mean a cold plate. Overnight lodgers also got breakfast, and that was often bread and milk or cider, although maybe a hasty pudding made with milk or molasses. And sometimes they got supper as well. The range of beverages that accompanied these meals was fairly wide. Customers elsewhere ordered egg pop, which is beer, cider, brandy, or wine mixed with eggs and sugar, or something called metheglin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is wine, honey water, and spices. Far and away, the most common charge in the accounts, and this will surprise no one, were New England or West Indian rum, which was sold by the quart, pint, half pint, and gill, which is like 4 or 5 ounces. And they also sold a lot of flip, which is a beverage made from beer, sweeteners, and rum, and sometimes eggs. And then it gets heated with a hot iron in order to create the sort of burnt, bitter taste that those palates in that moment preferred, and also, you know, to cook those eggs. So they sold flip by the mug and short mug. That was a very popular choice. And many visitors ordered a dram, a bitter dram, or a cherry dram. Mugs of cider were not uncommon, although I think cider is a little less common than popular historical imagination sort of would suggest. There's also plenty of demand in the record for bowls and short bowls of lemon, cherry, and egg punch. That's steady trade if sort of modest. The occasional posset and milk toddy, which is spiced hot milk curdled with ale, wine, or some other fermented beverage, was on offer too. And so the recipes for all those offerings and the ability to source the required ingredients constituted an important body of knowledge for tavern keeping women. And I just, for fun, have included a couple of things. If you're interested in the beverages of this period, just recently, a friend led me to this website. You can watch this video and get the recipe for lemon brandy from 1780. And I think this is a great, like if you're curious about what the palate in this period was interested in, that a friend of ours made this for New Year's Eve, and it's a great representation of what would have been popular at the time. And then here, this is a website, and if you Google this title, you'll come to it too, that has a really good recipe for flip, which we've made here in the house, and we now have a flip iron. Again, just to kind of get a sense of what the palate in this period kind of preferred. So all that work, the gathering of all those ingredients and provisioning the tavern, that's also work that fell to women alongside men. In Northampton at the Pomeroy Tavern, Polly Pomeroy, who gets interviewed by Sylvester Judd later, remembered that provisioning there fell to her mother, Miriam Clapp Pomeroy, who placed orders with men who were traveling to Boston or Springfield, or sometimes made the trip herself in the family's chaise. Writing about the advent of butchers to Hampshire County, Judd also writes, quote, "Meat was occasionally brought to Hadley in panniers or baskets from Pelham and other towns and sold to innkeepers and a few others. When Joshua Leonard opened his bakery at the south end of the Hadley Common, he tapped the advertising columns of the Gazette to assure, quote, merchants and tavern keepers that they may be supplied with barrels or cases of new bread put up in the best order. And more often, and even better, no payment will be required till it's all sold." So all of these businesses are, you know, interested in helping supply tavern keepers. A lot of this work also brought women together across households. So down in Hockenham, after Hugh Queen died, his wife Elizabeth continued to trade with the Pomeroy household, supplying winter apples and at least on one occasion 20 fowl to offset her own debts for rum. Jemima Parker Brace is the wife of a woodworker named William Brace, who also appears in the account book. We'll meet him again in a minute. She seems to have woven for the Pomeroy household, producing yards of woolen shirting and also a rag rug. There are a number of women who appear in the Pomeroy accounts, they're almost invisible. They're in the accounts of men, but they're accounts for spinning. So we know that some women in the households of those men are doing spinning for the Pomeroy family. And then Hockenham's Abigail Fairfield, or one of her stepdaughters, probably produced the 15.5 yards of table linen and other textiles for which Stephen Fairfield was credited in the 1760s. And Martha Ayres perhaps wove the 13 yards of bed tick, credited to her husband Samuel's account. So, you know, if you think about all the travelers and passers through that Mindwell is meant to, you know, put up when they're staying overnight, and you think about the mattresses, the mattress covers, the pillows, the sheeting, and all of that, there's a lot of women's work that is also important in the work of a tavern that is, you know, indirect. It's all been done before it comes to the tavern. So I thought, given that, I would just take a minute or two and we would look around some of the goods that populated a tavern in this period. So here's just some pieces of furniture, long benches, tavern tables. Taverns in this period were associated with these long tavern tables, and I couldn't find a good image of one, but here in the lower right is one from historic New England. Naturally, there's all the servingware, the punch bowls, the glasses, the pewter, you know, I found this lovely punch bowl strainer. And at the top left, you see that set table from Buckman's Tavern. But, you know, obviously, if we think about all the things you would need on hand to serve meals in the tavern is part of the picture. And then here I included a trundle bed because this William Brace is credited in the account book as having made a trundle bed. And so again, we're thinking about these flexible spaces. If somebody shows up with a lot of people, how do you make space for all of those lodgers? And trundle beds were part of that. So they also had to, you know, acquire and outfit that. We get a glimpse into some of this from probate inventories, which record all the things people had at the time of their death. Lucy Hubbard's probate inventory shows that her Hatfield Tavern was fairly well appointed. So it had 30 chairs, a large tavern table, 4 other tables of varying shapes and sizes, 7 chests, some with drawers. It had a gilt mirror and 3 plain mirrors, earthen and china dinner dishes, knives and forks, wine decanters, pint and quart-sized bowls, numerous bedsteads, bed curtains, and a corner cupboard in which many of these things would have sat, including some imported teaware. In Hadley, the 1750s inventory of James Kellogg tells us that that tavern also contained the familiar long table, as well as some 20 chairs, variously described as great, flag-bottomed, skin-bottomed, and bark-bottomed. That inn's hearth boasted some 10 meat roasters. So you start to get a sense of what might have made these spaces distinctive in the period. Lastly, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, just thinking about the material culture and the built environment of taverns, the White Horse Tavern was laid out pretty much like a house would have been in its day. But by the time Elizabeth Newton built the purpose-built tavern at the north end of the common, people are building the tavern activities into the infrastructure. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is that most taverns came to have these removable partitions. And sometimes they're just like screens that you take up and take down. In this example from Connecticut, they swing up to the roof when they need to be put out of the way. Sometimes they fold back, they're paneling that folds away. But the idea is that your upper floor can be one big room when you need it to be, or if you're trying to put several people up, you can make it into separate bedrooms. So we know that a few of the taverns in Hadley were set up this way, including the tavern run by Elisha and Martha Cook, which stood on the common towards where Route 9 is today, and the Warner Tavern, which stood toward the south end, that had folding doors that allowed the space to be partitioned into 2 rooms. So thinking about that work of cooking and cleaning, the Pomeroy Tavern served a wide range of customers and their hired men. So as an example, Elijah Albert's account regularly included entries in which he's charged for a short mug of stiff flip and lodging him and his man, as well as, quote, a gill of rum and eating some victuals in the morning. On another occasion, he paid for his, quote, and more and several other hands, including punch and 10 meals of victuals and lodging for 5 men. So I like to kind of picture that moment where these 5 guys roll up and need overnight lodging and food, and there you have it. Other entries routinely note dinner and drams for his logmen and his raftman. John Hunt was billed for 3 meals of victuals and lodging one night for his Negro, which tells us a little bit something about the clientele. Though Dr. Kellogg paid for a gill of rum by your Negro, Though customers of color were uncommon in Pomeroy's enterprise, they were apparently served. The lodging of Alvord's crew underscores the set of tasks associated not with the provision of food and drink, but again, the work of hosting overnight guests. And one of the things that the daughters of tavern keepers remember later in the 19th century is like the work of bringing a water pitcher up and cleaning out the water pitcher. And I'm sure that there were chamber pots that needed to be cleared away. So that kind of work of setting up the room for the guests and then clearing it out when they're gone. Some of that work, as I mentioned before, would have been undertaken by daughters in the household. So when the court first granted its license to Ebenezer and Mindwell Pomeroy, the couple had 6 daughters, 11 years old and younger. All but little toddler Mindwell likely contributed to the work of the inn and the farm that supported it. At that time, they had hired women, Desire Kentfield and Hannah Henry, who appear in the ledger only in accounts dating from the 1750s, which suggests to me that they were hiring help in the tavern until their own daughters were old enough to be more capable around the hearth. Again, you get a little glimpse into the labors of tavern keeping daughters in the recollections of Polly Pomeroy, whose parents kept a tavern on the Northampton side of the Connecticut River, and in those of a woman named Sarah Amsden, whose parents kept a tavern in Palmer. Both women years later remembered little snippets of what I like to think of as a girlhood apprenticeship in the trade, and a reminder that children were workers in these spaces. Amsden recalled in particular making the flip that her family's tavern served. And she said the flip iron she remembered was always hot on the coals in cold weather. Polly Pomeroy worked in her family's business from her childhood until about her mid-20s. When she was asked about 40 years later to reflect on that life, the first thing she thought of was beef roasting over the fire on a jack. It was her job to run downstairs and wind up that apparatus with the key and keep the meat turning. She also remembered sweeping the white sand onto and off of the floors to pick up the grease and then sweep it away and keep them clean. In addition to in daughters, of course, there were these hired women. And one of the great stories that comes out of the Porter Phelps Huntington papers is Persis Morse, who's a domestic servant up there. And she becomes pregnant out of wedlock while she's a servant at 40 Acres. And she's worried that Elizabeth and Charles Phelps are going to kick her out. And so in order to convince them that she should stay on, she tells them that years ago, she was a domestic servant in a tavern and she had a toddler at that time, and that the toddler would help her in her work, and she would send the child around to the rooms and he would pick up all the candlesticks and bring them to her for her to clean. And so that's another image that's really struck with me, this little 2 or 3 year old who is dispatched to help mom. And we also lastly know that enslaved labor was made use of in Hadley's taverns. The Warner Tavern in particular seems to have made use of enslaved labor. At least Elizabeth Phelps referenced Phyllis, Mr. Warner's Negro woman, in the management of their enterprise. And up in Deerfield, Lucy Terry Prince, who's well remembered today as probably the earliest Black poet in New England, was captured in Africa as an infant and purchased to work in the Deerfield Tavern of Ebenezer Wells. And that's that same family, the Wells Severance family up in Franklin County. And then lastly, here is the work of keeping order. Part of having a license to keep a tavern was a pledge that you would not let things get out of hand. You'd keep a lid on drunkenness. And there was also a lot of concern about gambling, which became an issue in Hadley because a gambling club sort of cropped up that apparently was irresistible. Elizabeth Porter Phelps reported to her daughter the concern over this gambling club, and she writes, many of them are married men, had come to the pulpit when one husband who'd been staying out all night had missed the birth of his child, his wife having suffered what they called a sore travail, so she had a hard labor in his absence. So the community of women around town voiced some displeasure over all of this. He winds up retreating to the gambling club again for a day and a night. Another mother told Phelps that she had 3 sons in the club, but none of them, unsurprisingly, had been in church to hear the sermon in question. This town has got to be very loose, Phelps complained, but what could be done? because, as Phelps added, there was a tavern keeper said the other day, "How can I prevent gambling in my house? There are some of the best men and some of the first characters in town." So you can imagine the challenge of keeping a lid on unruly behavior, depending on who was misbehaving. And lastly, I just want to say a word about women's work keeping boarders. Taverns sometimes functioned as boarding houses, and short and long-term lodgers were both common. In 1769, there was a boarder lodging at the Pomeroy Tavern for 16 weeks. So that's a long time to have somebody in your house. But taverns and boarding houses were also distinct enterprises with different features. So in the 19th century, boarding house keeping is going to become a big occupation for women, but it was also important in the 19th century, often as a way to kind of generate ad hoc income. So while in Litchfield, Elizabeth Phelps Huntington, her husband was the minister there, but they were short on cash and had a growing family. So she took in boarders, students at the local law school of Tapping Reeve. And then when they moved back to Hadley and went to 40 Acres and Dan Huntington became the principal at Hopkins Academy, they took in students at Hopkins for boarding. So, it's a strategy to generate a little income. In 1819, Hadley's Porter family hit some hard times when a lottery that was supposed to fund the construction of a bridge had failed, leaving Samuel Porter on the hook for a lot of the debts. And the family was at some risk of losing their property, but his wife, Lucy Hubbard Porter, and their children all rallied by taking in boarders. And there's a reminiscence of Lucy that remembers her being, quote, "always in motion and never sits down but at meals until sunset." And one of the things that I got asked a lot as I was working on this project was how often women were guests in taverns. And so I went through the Elizabeth Porter Phelps diary to see, what I could discover about that. And there are 50 different taverns around Massachusetts and Connecticut and New England that get mentioned in the diary as places that she lodged. So here's one in Shrewsbury. George Washington would sleep in this tavern, as did Elizabeth Porter Phelps. There's taverns in Worcester and Leicester, anything on the way to Boston and north of that in Spencer. And then trips south when her daughter lived in Litchfield, there were taverns all along that route too. And here's one that is still a restaurant today. So you can visit that restaurant and catch a feel for what it would have been like in Elizabeth Porter Phelps's day. And I'll add on this note that these women then who were tavern keepers also became known far and wide. And when Elizabeth Newton died in 1820, 5 different Boston papers published word of her death. And it just kind of reminds us that everyone expected there were a lot of people who would want to know that Mrs. Newton had passed away. So it just reminds us that they are public figures in a way that we might not have expected. Oh, and then I just wanted to show you that Elizabeth Porter Phelps, they also traveled to Boston a lot on Charles's business. And the main boarding house that they patronized there was run by a woman named Catherine Gray, who had the help of her 2 sisters. It was next door to the American Coffee House on State Street. And I don't know if you can actually see it in this image or not, because you can't read the signs, but I imagine it is somewhere in this view. Gray advertised genteel boarding and lodging, which apparently suited the Phelps better than the other places they had gone before. Every spring, they would show up at Mrs. Gray's for a night or 2 while they, transacted business in Boston. Maybe Elizabeth Phelps found this a little more comfortable. The gentility probably appealed to her. Gray was about her age, so maybe the 2 women had friends in common. It was also probably pretty well appointed. The 1798 direct tax describes Gray's building as a 3-story, 1,800 square foot brick house with no fewer than 38 windows. So one can imagine that the rooms would be spacious, well lit, and comfortable. Also, it was served by 2 stage lines, one to Portsmouth and one to Newburyport. So again, you can imagine the kind of people who'd be coming and going, and maybe it was a lively place again to gather news. Closer to home, there's a Hatfield boarding house that became important in my studies of Rebecca Dickinson. And I don't think this is actually it, but it's another house in the same family that Rebecca Dickinson would have known. But as a never married woman, she boarded at her sister Miriam's tavern. Miriam and Silas ran down the street. And so she would go there to take her meals every day. And so did local school teachers, Isaac Curson and Patty Reynolds. And so they might have been lodging also at the Billings Tavern, but there's this great, Dickinson's diary is full of how lonely and sad she was. And she is going over there for lunch, I think it is, one day. And she says, the company is more than the provision. So for her, it was, you know, like, yes, I need to have lunch, but she also just wanted to be around people more than she was as a woman living alone. But that work could be hard and demanding, and we get a little glimpse into this by a reference that Phelps makes to Martha Warner that suggests that she was not altogether happy in her circumstances as an innkeeper. Phelps confided to her daughter, "Brother Warner and sister made a little accidental visit. She says she is terrible homesick, was never much from home before." Phelps reminded the melancholy bride how dreadfully you used to feel, and others which I knew of. But to no avail. She says she must go home this week and stay at least 3 weeks. Has almost entirely done eating. How it will terminate, I don't know. Brother seems to be kind and attentive, but the tavern and the boarders are a trouble. So with that, I'm just going to close. I'll show you one last view, which is just kind of fun. I expect everybody on this call recognizes the Crane Tavern in Hadley. And one of the most important sources on the history of Hadley is Sylvester Judd's oral histories that he took in the early 19th century. And a lot of them he took here in this tavern. People would gather in the tavern. Judd would come with his notebook and he'd talk to people. So the tavern itself becomes a site for the history of taverns. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions people have.
Marla?
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Ted Cozier. We live on Middle Street. And my question is, right at the end of our street is the Ben Smith Tavern, which I've been in. It's now a rental property. Have you done any research on that, or could you tell us anything about that?
You know, I didn't do a lot of research into the Ben Smith Tavern. There are a couple of good photos that were taken inside that structure. Are they in the Clifton Johnson papers even, maybe? But I didn't research it. I kind of stuck to my case studies. So I looked deep into the Newton family because there's an account book that survives at the Hadley Historical Society about the Newtons. And of course, I looked at the White Horse Tavern because there's an account book that survives. But other than that, I mostly just tried to understand like how far apart taverns would be and some of the purposes of them. But no, I'm sorry, I didn't dig deep into the Ben Smith Tavern, although it's a great building and I'd love to get in there sometime.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Ted, this is Al Weinberg. Can you hear me? Ted?
You're on mute.
No.
Yes,
Yeah, Ted, the Hadley Historical Society's got a folder on the Ben Smith Tavern. We got quite a bit on it sometime. I'll have to.
okay, great.
And Marla, I have a question for you, Marla. Al Weinberg.
Yeah.
How many of the taverns in that period in Hadley still are standing? I know White Horse is, and the Warner Tavern is.
Yeah, well, let me think.
A Crane Tavern, where's that?
There's one that stands that I didn't write a lot about up in North Hadley. I'm trying to, in my mind, go north to south. There's at least one in North Hadley. There's the tavern on the north end of the common, the Crane in the middle, the Warner at the bottom, the Kellogg Tavern at the bottom, the White Horse Tavern. And then there was one, I want to say, that still stands that I only discovered kind of late in the project out in Hartsbrook or on the way to Hartsbrook. So there's a handful. There's a handful around. One of the things I learned in the course of the research is that people, when they were going to buy a tavern or start a tavern, were thinking about like, how far is it to the next tavern? You know, like you're trying to figure out the scope of your clientele. And so pretty much there's a tavern every half mile to mile that serves some neighborhood because they're important. Taverns were super important nodes of neighborhood life. And so every neighborhood really had one.
And Marla, where's the Crane Tavern? I'm not sure I know where that one is.
Oh, it's the big house that is on the corner of West Street and Route 9 that's very close to the road.
Oh, the bottles.
Yeah.
Is there a better way to describe that? Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I know where it is.
Yeah, it's the house with the constant tag sale.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Nabals.
There's some descriptions of the inside of that I wonder, how much of the building fabric be fun to see. Some of these panels. Mary's got her hand up.
Marla, thank you. This was wonderful. I have to say how impressed I am. You can even read this handwriting. It just is so laborious looking at trying to read line after line and figure out the words, and the spelling is all over the place. And thank you for making it presentable in a way to find out so much more about it. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for saying that, Mary. I have a pipe dream about your account book. So the account books are organized by client, right? So you'll have a page for Joe Smith and a page for Bob Jones, and it goes through. But what would be really interesting to do is rearrange all that material chronologically. So that would be a big task of database making, but it'd be interesting to see what patterns are revealed if you could look at the information in a slightly different format.
Well, just let us know. If you're willing to do it, we'd love to have you work on it.
Now, if somebody's interested in buying your books, would you like to direct them to where they supposed to?
Yeah, that's nice of you to suggest. I hate to say it's an academic book by an academic press, so it's expensive. So I think your best bet is going to be, oh, Mary's got it. There it is. Yep. I hate to say it, but go to Amherst Books. I'm sure that they can find it. Would be the best thing is to go to your local bookstore, and they can probably find it.
Or, I have an idea. Maybe I can manage to get one copy for our senior center and lend to people. So for those who maybe cannot afford it. So that will be nice to have in our library.
Yeah, it'll be in the big library as well.
Yeah, I'll be eager to, see if folks in Hadley, see patterns and things that they recognize and are interesting. Like I say, we all know that women in the past worked really hard, right? And I think we look at our lives today and, you run the tap and it's easy to get water, and it's, you do the microwave, it's easy to heat something up. And when you think about the sort of Herculean effort that every small thing took in the 18th century, it's, to me, it's really moving to look at the lives that women led in the past and kind of realize the hard work that's behind it. Every last thing, laying your head on the pillow at the end of the night meant somebody had, created that thread and woven it into fabric and made it into a pillow, and somebody had harvested those feathers, and, just everything that those folks did, there's just a world of work behind it. And so that's kind of my mission in the book, is to just kind of help heighten people's sensibility, so that you see and think about that when you see something, and not just in the past, but today. Who made this thing that I'm enjoying? How did it get made? How did it get here? Who did all this work so that I can have this lovely thing I'm having?
Your mother's thing that she made from the, you still have.
Well, I guess if there's no more questions,
I think Ted wanted to say
we
something.
can thank everybody, and Marla and Alan and Hadley Media that recorded this presentation. And I believe it's going to be available to see for limited time on our YouTube channel and the local cable TV channel. I do not know the times exactly, but you can always check with us or check simply our YouTube channel or the schedule for the channel 191, and you will be able to find out the times that it's going to be on. So any other questions? No?
Thanks so much, Marla.
Thanks,
We have
everybody.
Thank you.
We have our director with us, Haley. Maybe she would like to say hello to all of you.
Hi, and hi, Marla. It's been a while since I have seen your face, and
Yeah.
thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I've long had a dream of joining programs designed for older adults and the humanities in a place that I am. And so this was a really wonderful example of that. And thank you so much. And I'm already, my head is spinning with ideas of walking tours and getting in touch with our mutual friend, Plune Bericious, and seeing if she might have some, public humanities ideas about how to bring this knowledge to the people in this community in a different way when it's safer to gather in person. So thank you. And I'm so delighted that this was popular and well received. And thank you to the Hadley Historical Commission. I hope we can join in the future to do similar kinds of programming. This was just the best. Thank you.
Really
Just say-
appreciate you. Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, I was going to say on the Hadley Historical Society, usually every year we put together a program of 5 or 6 lectures live. We haven't been able to do this because of the pandemic and because a lot of our members don't do Zoom very well. So we're hoping to look forward to hopefully at the end of this year, certainly next year, of doing these kinds of programs, co-sponsoring them with whoever, the senior center, the library, and having them in live venues. That we have 2 excellent venues now in the senior center and also in the new library. We'll be able to do these programs, and we've done them in the past. They've been very well received and a lot of fun. And Hadley's got so much history to enjoy. So we're looking forward to doing that again. If we have to, we'll do more Zoom ones too, if we must.
Well, and when we're back in live engagement, as we all want to be, I just want to say again, the collections of the Hadley Historical Society is just full of gems and treasures. So hopefully there'll be a future time when people who are, interested can go and see these account books and lay eyes on them yourself. So I know we're all looking forward to that future time when we can do that again.